welcome to another deep dive. You know how sometimes you hear someone speaking another language and think, wow, I wish I could do that? Well, today we're going to tackle speaking English fluently. We'll be looking at a podcast. It's called How to Learn English Speaking Easily.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
packed with tips. And one thing that really resonated with me right off the bat was how they addressed the fear of making mistakes. I mean, isn't that like the biggest hurdle for most language learners?
For sure. It's like this invisible barrier that keeps so many people from even trying.
Yeah, the grammar, you got the vocab, but then you have to actually open your mouth and speak, and suddenly it's like all those words vanish into thin air.
It's almost like stage fright.
Yeah.
But for speaking,
Which is interesting because the podcast points out that mistakes are actually essential for learning.
oh, that's a good point. It's like when you're learning any new skill,
Yeah.
you're going to mess up a few times before you get it right.
Exactly. Think about a baby learning to walk. They fall down constantly, but they get back up each time, and eventually they're running around. Right. It's all part of the process.
Yeah.
And with language, the more mistakes you make, the more you learn.
And the podcast also talks about the lack of confidence, which often goes hand in hand with that fear of making mistakes.
Yeah, like you might understand English perfectly when you're reading or listening, but then when it comes to speaking, you just freeze up.
It's like your brain knows what to do, but your mouth can't keep up.
Totally. And one thing they suggest for overcoming this is what they call immersive learning.
Ah, yes. Immersive learning. This is a fascinating concept.
It is.
I-
But what exactly does it mean? Does it mean like packing your bags and moving to an English-speaking country?
Well, it could, but it doesn't have to be that drastic. It's more about creating an English-speaking environment wherever you are.
So like surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
Exactly. Think about changing your phone settings to English, watching movies and TV shows in English, listening to English music, even just narrating your daily activities in English.
Oh, I like that. It's like making English a constant part of your life.
Right. The idea is to expose yourself to the language as much as possible so that it becomes more natural and less intimidating.
And speaking of exposure, the podcast also mentions this technique called shadowing.
Oh, yes, shadowing. This is a fantastic way to improve your pronunciation and fluency.
I've heard of it, but honestly, it sounds a little bit creepy, like you're following someone around and repeating everything they say.
Haha. Well, not exactly. It's more like you choose a recording of a native speaker, maybe a podcast or an audiobook, and you listen to it, and then you repeat what they're saying, trying to match their pronunciation and intonation as closely as possible.
So it's like you're their vocal shadow.
Precisely. And
Okay.
what's great about shadowing is that it not only helps with your pronunciation, but it also helps you get a feel for the rhythm and flow of natural English speech.
That makes sense, because spoken English is so different from written English, right?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
There are all these subtle nuances in the intonation and rhythm that you just don't get from reading a textbook.
Right, so shadowing is a way to kind of absorb those nuances naturally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more you practice, the more comfortable and confident you'll become with speaking English.
But what if you don't have anyone to practice with? Like, what if you live in a place where there aren't many English speakers?
That's a common challenge.
Yeah.
But luckily, we live in a digital age where you can connect with people from all over the world online.
True, there are tons of language exchange platforms and online communities.
Exactly. You can find language partners who are learning your native language, and you can help each other practice.
That's a great idea. And you can even practice speaking with AI assistants like Siri or Alexa.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
That's a fun and low-pressure way to get some speaking practice in, and it can be surprisingly helpful.
Okay, so we've got immersive learning, we've got shadowing, we've got online resources. What about this tip I heard about talking to yourself in English? At first, I thought that was kind of weird, but then,
But then it started to make sense.
yeah, because we're constantly talking to ourselves in our heads anyway, right?
Right. We have this inner monologue going on all the time.
So why not switch that inner monologue to English?
Exactly. It's a great way to get comfortable with forming sentences and expressing your thoughts in English.
And you don't have to worry about making mistakes because no one's listening except you.
Exactly. You can experiment with different words and phrases and just get used to the sound of your own voice speaking English.
It's like turning your everyday life into an English practice session.
Precisely. And the podcast emphasizes that this is a really effective way to make progress without feeling overwhelmed.
Speaking of feeling overwhelmed, they also talk about the importance of learning phrases, not just individual words.
Ah, yes. That's a crucial point.
Because in real conversations, we don't just speak in single words, right? We use phrases and expressions.
Exactly. Think about it. You wouldn't just learn the word happy. You'd learn, I'm happy,
Mm.
or that makes me happy, or I'm so happy to see you,
Right. So by learning phrases, you're learning how words are actually used in context.
And you're also learning how to express yourself more naturally and fluently.
It's like having pre-made building blocks for spoken English.
Exactly. And it can really help you avoid that feeling of being lost for words in a conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of really helpful techniques, but there's one that I'm kind of curious about and a little intimidated by, and that's the idea of thinking in English.
Ah, yes, thinking in English. This is where things start to get really interesting.
I know, right? But is it even possible? I mean, I've always translated everything in my head from my native language to English.
It's definitely a challenge, but it is possible. And it can make a huge difference in your fluency.
So how do you even begin to do that?
Well, the podcast suggests starting small. Don't try to translate complex thoughts right away. Just start by thinking about simple things in English, like the objects around you, your daily activities, even just single words.
So like instead of thinking I'm hungry in my native language, I would think I'm hungry in English.
Exactly. It might feel a little strange at first, but the more you do it, the more natural it will become.
And eventually you'll be able to think in English without even realizing it.
Right. It's like building a new pathway in your brain.
Okay, I'm definitely going to try that. But it
Oh.
sounds like it takes a lot of practice and patience.
It does, but the rewards are well worth it. Imagine being able to speak English as effortlessly as you speak your native language.
That would be incredible. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of great techniques for improving spoken English, but let's be real, consistency is key, right? How do we actually build a daily English speaking habit?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm.
And the podcast offers some really practical tips for making English a regular part of your routine.
Okay, I'm all ears because I struggle with this.
Well, one of their key suggestions is to set a fixed time each day for English practice.
So like scheduling a meeting with yourself, but for English.
Exactly. Even if
Okay.
it's just for 15 minutes, make it a non-negotiable part of your day.
Okay, that makes sense. But what do you actually DO during that time? Like, do you just sit there and stare at a wall?
Uh-huh. No. There are tons of things you can do. Remember that speaking journal idea we talked about earlier? Instead of writing in a journal, you could record yourself speaking about your day, your thoughts, your goals. Anything that comes to mind?
Oh, I like that. It's like talking to a friend, but the friend is a recording device.
Exactly. And it's a great way to track your progress and get comfortable with hearing your own voice speaking English.
They also mentioned something about mirror practice, right?
Yes. It might sound a little silly, but it can be surprisingly helpful.
So you just stand in front of the mirror and talk to yourself in English.
Exactly. It's a great way to practice your pronunciation, facial expressions, and body language.
It's like giving a presentation, but your audience is you.
Exactly. And the best part is you can't judge yourself too harshly because you're the only one watching.
So we've got the fixed time slot, we've got the speaking journal, we've got the mirror practice. Are there any other techniques they recommend?
Oh, there are plenty more. For example, they suggest joining online challenges.
Online challenges, like what kind of challenges?
There are all sorts of challenges out there. Some focus on speaking, some focus on vocabulary, some focus on grammar. But the idea is to have a structured program with daily prompts and a community of other learners to support you.
Oh, that sounds fun. It's like having a virtual study buddy.
Exactly. And it can be really motivating to have other people to share your progress with and to learn from.
I bet. But sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the time or the resources, it's finding the motivation. How do they suggest combating those days when you just don't feel like speaking English?
Well, one of their biggest pieces of advice is to make English fun. Talk about topics you're passionate about, whether it's movies, sports, music, books, whatever sparks your interest. When you're enjoying what you're learning, it doesn't feel like a chore.
So if you're going to talk to yourself in the mirror anyway, you might as well talk about something interesting.
Exactly. And the more you enjoy it, the more likely you are to stick with it.
They also mentioned something about tracking progress, right?
Absolutely. Whether you use a calendar, an app, or just a simple notebook, marking your practice days and noting your achievements can be incredibly motivating.
It's like giving yourself a pat on the back for every step forward.
Exactly. It's a visual reminder of how far you've come and how much effort you're putting in.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's clear that there are tons of practical and creative ways to build that daily English-speaking habit. But let's face it, sometimes the biggest obstacle isn't the lack of resources or techniques, it's the fear.
You're absolutely right. That fear of making mistakes, sounding silly, or being judged can be paralyzing for many learners.
Oh.
Fortunately, the podcast delves into that too, offering some really insightful advice on overcoming that fear and finally speaking with confidence.
So how do we tackle this fear? Because it can really hold you back,
It
right?
can. It's like a wall that prevents you from progressing. But the good news is that the podcast offers some great advice on how to overcome it.
Okay, because I think that's what a lot of people struggle with. They know they need to practice, but the fear is just so strong.
It's understandable. But one thing the podcast emphasizes is that mistakes are actually a good thing.
Wait, what? Mistakes are good. How can that be?
Think about it. When you make a mistake, you learn from it. You realize what you did wrong, and you try to do it better next time.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's still hard to embrace mistakes, especially when you're speaking in front of other people.
I know. But the podcast reminds us that everyone makes mistakes. It's part of the learning process. Even native English speakers make mistakes sometimes.
That's true. I guess we tend to be our own worst critics.
Exactly. We're often much harder on ourselves than others would be.
So how do we shift that mindset? How do we stop being so afraid of making mistakes?
Well, one thing the podcast suggests is to keep a mistake journal.
A mistake journal? What's that?
It's basically a notebook where you write down the mistakes you make when you're speaking English.
Okay. But why would you want to dwell on your mistakes? Wouldn't that just make you feel worse?
Not necessarily. The idea is to analyze your mistakes so you can learn from them. For example, you might notice that you keep making the same grammar mistake over and over again.
Oh, I see. So by writing it down, you become more aware of it, and you can start to correct it.
Exactly. It's like turning your mistakes into valuable learning opportunities.
That's a great way to reframe it. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, you see them as stepping stones to fluency.
Right. And the podcast also talks about the importance of starting small.
Starting small, what do you mean by that?
I mean, don't try to jump into complex conversations right away. Start with simple phrases and sentences. Build your confidence gradually.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. It's like learning to swim. You don't start in the deep end, you start in the shallow end and gradually work your way up.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to language learning.
So what are some examples of starting small?
Well, you could start by practicing simple greetings like hello and goodbye, or you could practice ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions.
Right. Those are all situations where you can use simple phrases and you don't have to worry about having a long conversation.
And as you get more comfortable, you can gradually increase the complexity of the conversations you're having.
Okay, that's helpful. But what about the environment? Does it matter where you practice speaking English?
It can. The podcast recommends finding a safe and supportive environment to practice.
Safe and supportive, what does that mean?
It means finding a place where you feel comfortable making mistakes without being judged. It could be your own home, or it could be with a close friend or family member who is also learning English.
Oh, I get it. It's about creating a space where you can experiment and make mistakes without feeling embarrassed.
Exactly. Because when you feel safe and supported, you're more likely to take risks and push yourself outside of your comfort zone.
And that's where the real growth happens, right?
Absolutely. And the podcast also mentions the importance of finding supportive speaking partners.
Supportive speaking partners, so not just anyone will do.
Well, ideally, you want to find someone who is patient, encouraging, and understanding. Someone who will celebrate your successes and help you learn from your mistakes.
That sounds like a great combination. But where do you find people like that?
Well, there are a lot of online platforms and communities dedicated to language learning. You could also join a local language exchange group, or even just ask a friend or family member who speaks English if they'd be willing to practice with you.
Okay, I'm starting to see that the key to overcoming the fear of speaking English is to create a supportive environment for yourself, both internally and externally.
Exactly. And once you've done that, you can start to focus on building your confidence.
And that leads us to another challenge that the podcast addresses, the feeling of not being good enough.
Ah, yes, that feeling of, I'll never be able to speak English fluently, or I'll always sound like a foreigner.
It's so easy to get caught up in those negative thoughts.
It is. But the podcast reminds us that fluency is a journey, not a destination. It's not about being perfect. It's about being able to communicate effectively.
Right. It's about getting your message across, even if you make a few mistakes along the way.
Exactly. And the podcast encourages us to shift our focus from perfection to communication.
So instead of worrying about every little grammar rule or pronunciation detail, we should focus on expressing ourselves clearly and confidently.
Exactly. And one way to do that is to prepare common phrases in advance.
Prepare common phrases. What do you mean?
I mean, if you know you're going to be in a specific situation where you'll need to use English, like a job interview or a presentation, you can practice some common phrases beforehand.
Oh, I see. So it's like having a script or a cheat sheet to help you feel more prepared and confident.
Exactly. And it can really take the pressure off because you won't have to think about what to say on the spot.
That's a great tip. But even with preparation, there's always that nagging feeling of inadequacy, like you're not as good as native English speakers.
I know. It's easy to compare ourselves to others and feel like we're falling short.
Especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with images and videos of people who seem to be perfect at everything.
Right. But the podcast makes a really important point about this. They remind us that everyone learns at their own pace.
Oh, that's a good reminder, because it's easy to get discouraged when you see other people who seem to be progressing faster than you.
It is. But the truth is there's no right or wrong way to learn a language. What matters is that you're putting in the effort and making progress at your own pace.
So we need to be patient with ourselves and celebrate our own small victories.
Exactly. And the podcast encourages us to focus on the joy of learning. Remember why you started learning English in the first place. What are your goals? What do you want to be able to do with the language?
That's a great point, because when you focus on the positive aspects of language learning, it becomes much easier to stay motivated.
And speaking of motivation, the podcast also shares some great tips for staying motivated on your language learning journey.
Oh, perfect, because I think that's something that everyone struggles with at some point. It's easy to get started, but it's hard to keep going when things get tough.
Yeah, I agree. But the podcast offers some really helpful advice on how to stay motivated and reach your goals.
You know, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, but there's one thing that keeps coming up again and again, and that's the idea of immersion.
It's really the cornerstone of everything, isn't it?
It feels like it's more than just a technique. It's almost like a philosophy of language learning.
Exactly. It's about weaving English into the fabric of your daily life.
Right. And I think that's what makes it so effective, because it's not just about studying grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary words. It's about experiencing the language in a natural and authentic way.
It's about surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
And the podcast hosts gave some really cool examples of how to do that. Like, remember they talked about changing your phone settings to English.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. It's such a simple change, but it can make a big difference.
Because you're constantly interacting with your phone, right? So it's like a constant stream of English input.
And they also talked about watching movies and TV shows in English, listening to English music, even playing video games in English.
Right. And the cool thing is that we have access to so much amazing English content these days, thanks to streaming services and the internet.
It's like having an endless library of English at your fingertips.
Exactly. But it's not just about passively consuming content, right? It's about actively engaging with it.
Absolutely. The podcast emphasizes that active engagement is key to making progress with immersion.
So, like, instead of just watching a movie in English, you could try to repeat phrases that you hear or write down new vocabulary words.
Or you could even try to have a conversation with the characters in the movie.
Oh, that's a fun idea. It's like turning your living room into an English-speaking stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more you interact with the language, the more you'll internalize it.
And they had some really interesting suggestions for how to use technology for active immersion. Like, remember they talked about using voice assistants like Siri or Alexa.
Oh, yeah. That's a great way to practice your speaking skills without feeling self-conscious.
Because you're just talking to a machine, right? So there's no pressure to be perfect.
Exactly. You can ask Siri or Alexa questions, give them commands, even have a little chat with them.
And it's surprisingly helpful because you have to think about how to phrase your questions and responses in English.
Right. It forces you to use the language in a practical way.
They also talked about finding language exchange partners online.
Oh, yeah. Language exchange is fantastic. It's a win-win situation because you get to help someone learn your native language while they help you learn English.
And you can connect with people from all over the world, which is pretty cool.
It's like having a virtual pen pal, but you get to actually talk to them.
I'm starting to see that immersion is about so much more than just learning a language. It's about opening yourself up to new cultures, new perspectives, new ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. It's a truly enriching experience.
But it doesn't have to be a solitary journey either.
Right. The podcast talks about the importance of finding a community of other English learners.
Because learning a language can be challenging, and it's helpful to have people to support you along the way.
Exactly. And there's so many ways to connect with other learners these days. You can join online forums, Facebook groups, language exchange apps, even attend virtual meetups.
It's like having a built-in cheerleading squad for your English learning journey.
Exactly. And the podcast emphasizes that this sense of community can make all the difference in staying motivated and reaching your goals.
Well, I think this deep dive has been incredibly insightful and inspiring. I feel like I have a whole new toolkit for improving my spoken English.
Me too. And I'm excited to put some of these techniques into practice.
So what's one small step you can take today to make English a more immersive part of your life?
That's a great question.
Think about it, and remember, even small changes can make a big difference over time.
Absolutely. The key is to be consistent and to find ways to make English a fun and rewarding part of your daily routine.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of speaking English. We hope you've learned something new and that you're feeling motivated to keep practicing and improving.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Until next time, keep those English muscles working.